from Lampang man to digital nomads. A history of Thailand. The Paknam Incident. On the 13th of July 1893, a major diplomatic incident occurred in Southeast Asia. That day, 3 French gunboats appeared off the coast of Paknam in the Kingdom of Siam, the pre-modern name for Thailand. The Siamese were wary of the French. Back in the late 1850s, they had begun gaining influence and land in Indochina, eventually conquering much of what we now call Vietnam, and then making their way into Cambodia. This was a threat to the Siamese, who in addition to ruling over modern-day Thailand, also controlled much of Laos at the time. The government of Siam in Bangkok had managed to handle the expansion of the French in Indochina well for many years, steering clear of conflict in an age when nearly every native power in Africa and Asia was being conquered and colonized by the Europeans. But at Paknam on this summer's day in 1893, a major incident occurred. The local commander of a coastal fort sent his ships out and fired a salvo against the 3 French ships, which were violating Siamese sovereign waters. The Paknam Incident led to the outbreak of the Franco-Siamese Crisis, a 3-month-long pseudo-war, at the end of which the Siamese government ceded Laos to the French. However, Siam remained independent, despite this loss of territory. Indeed, it would be one of just a handful of nations in Asia that retained its independence during the age of imperialism, along with Japan, China, Persia and Afghanistan. How had little Siam survived? More broadly, what was its story in the many centuries and even millennia leading up to the Paknam Incident? This is the history of Siam and Thailand, Lampang man and prehistoric Thailand. The region which we know as Thailand today has been inhabited by modern human beings for nearly 1 million years. Archaeological investigations in the Lampang region of northern Thailand have found fossils of Homo erectus, an ancestor of modern Homo sapiens, as far back as between 1 million and 500,000 years ago. Southeast Asia is generally not written about in the same way as Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, or China, as an early centre of advanced human civilization. And yet there is evidence of rice being cultivated in Thailand by the 3rd millennium BC, indicating agriculture was known of here at least 4,500 years ago. What we generally find is a more delayed pattern than in the most advanced areas of civilization. For instance, while the Bronze Age is generally synonymous with the 2nd millennium BC in the Middle East, copper and bronze only began to be extensively utilised by the people of the Thai peninsula around 2,500 years ago, the middle of the 1st millennium BC. Similarly, while the Iron Age was underway in the Eastern Mediterranean, by the start of the 1st millennium BC, it took another 1,000 years before iron was being widely used by the people who lived in what is now Thailand. The Ban Chang culture. This more delayed development is not to suggest that Thailand did not have some flourishing cultures in ancient times. Take the example of the Ban Chang culture. Our understanding of this focuses on an archaeological site in Thailand, which is considered to be the most important prehistoric site of its kind found anywhere in Southeast Asia. It was consequently inscribed by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site in 1992, a remarkable development in and of itself, as the Ban Chang site was only first discovered 26 years earlier, in 1966. Its name derives from it being located in the Ban Chang district of Udon Thani, province in the northeast of Thailand, near Cambodia and Laos. It lies within the water basin of the Mekong River, an important factor as agriculture was practiced here, and these were settlement sites that needed fresh water supplies for both farming and general sustenance. There are numerous layers in the archaeological record. The oldest ones indicate that humans were living here and practicing agriculture in Neolithic times. Layers above this are mounds that were formed by successive civilizations and which indicate that a more advanced society was living here between the middle of the 1st millennium BC and the early 1st millennium AD, so from around 400 BC to 200 AD. Each of these periods in the history of the Ban Chang site is important. For instance, the earliest ones suggested that agriculture was being practiced in this part of Southeast Asia earlier than archaeologists and historians had previously believed. The most exciting discovery, though, was a vast trove of extremely very well preserved reddish pottery, consisting of large urns, vases and other objects that were produced by the inhabitants here in the later period, between 400 BC and 200 AD, These discoveries caused historians to re-evaluate their understanding of late Bronze Age/early Iron Age culture in northern Thailand, as this pottery was of a far better quality than would previously have been expected. Unfortunately, in the early 21st century, it was revealed that some of the pottery and other goods from the Ban Chiang site had ended up on the antiquities black market. The Indianization of Thailand. A major development in Thai history was the Indianization of the region. The subcontinent of India, particularly the more northerly regions around the Indus Valley in the west, and in Bengal in the northeast, was one of the great early centres of Eurasian civilization. In the course of the first millennium, AD Indian culture began spreading southeastwards into Indochina and other parts of Southeast Asia. The most notable feature of this was the arrival of both Hinduism and Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism would influence Thailand in a great way, and the country remains one of the major centres of this form of monastic Buddhism to this day. The introduction of both Buddhism and Hinduism not only brought new forms of religious worship, they also transformed the built environment, art and literature of Thailand. The country has become dotted with temples and other monumental buildings since the first millennium AD that essentially reflect building practices that were imported from India. Beyond this, the Indianization of Thailand involved the import of ideas about kingship and political organisation. This, in turn, led to the development of more sophisticated forms of governance and larger states that were able to govern more people. Finally, the very fact that Indian culture was permeating Thailand is indicative of expanding trade networks and maritime traffic in the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea. As such, more goods were passing through Thailand's ports and the region was becoming wealthier. This was not all to do with India. Some of it was indirectly the result of the considerable amount of maritime trade which was taking place between China and the Roman ports of the Red Sea, as silk, jade and other exotic goods were taken thousands of kilometres by sea from China to Egypt and Arabia, often with Indian merchants acting as intermediaries. The arrival of the Thai people. A key question emerges when a person studies the early history of this part of the world. If the earliest humans here are known as Lampang Man, or cultures like the Ban Chiang, then why is it known as Thailand today? The answer lies in developments in the first millennium AD, around the time the Iron Age was blossoming in Southeast Asia, and while the Norse migrations out of Scandinavia were occurring on the other side of Eurasia. It was around this time that a group of Siamese people known as the Thai, generally spelled without an H when referring to them in centuries gone by, began migrating south from China towards Southeast Asia. Their origins have been traced to the Guangxi region of China, which they and several other Indo-Chinese groups began migrating out of in the 7th century and 8th centuries AD as the Chinese state expanded. Some of this might well have been migratory pressure caused by the simultaneous incursion of large numbers of Turks into northern and western China. This, in turn, placed pressure on the Han Chinese, who moved southwards in great numbers and displaced groups like the Thai. They then moved into what we call Indochina and spread out around the modern-day countries of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. The Thai people, unsurprisingly, concentrated in Thailand, and over time became the dominant ethno-linguistic group here. Though modern Thailand has a somewhat mixed ethnic landscape, with considerable communities of Chinese, Khmer, Malay, Hmong and Karen people living in various parts of the country. The Khmer Empire in Thailand. The Thai people were migrating into a part of Southeast Asia where a much more settled people were starting to emerge as the dominant regional power. These were the Khmer people, a group that had migrated into Indochina, especially around modern-day Cambodia, as early as the 2nd millennium BC. In the late 8th century, their rulers began to build up what has become known as the Khmer Empire, a state that ruled over much of the mainland of Southeast Asia, including substantial parts of modern-day Thailand. Up until this point, there was no major central power that dominated large parts of Thailand. There were localised rulers, and what we might even call small city-states, but no major imperial state. That changed as the Khmer began to expand into northern Thailand. Eventually they would come to rule over a huge part of Indochina from their great capital, Angkor Wat, which for a time at its peak in the 13th century was possibly the largest city in the world. Khmer rule in Thailand was not always harmonious. There were clashes between the Khmer and the Thai and other groups as they sought to maintain their independence. Like other great empires of the past, once the initial period of conflict was over, the defeated powers began to see the benefits of imperial rule. Trade flourished, and the Khmer brought about a greater degree of urban development in northern and central Thailand. Their more advanced systems of government and architecture also diffused into Thailand and ensured that Thai society became more advanced under Khmer rule. The clearest expression of this came in the late 13th century, when the first native Thai script, or writing system, emerged. The first inscriptions in this written Thai language date to around the middle of the 1280s, just as Khmer rule was starting to weaken in the region. The Thai script was heavily influenced by the Old Khmer script, meaning that Khmer imperial rule from Cambodia brought with it an expansion of cultural development in Thailand. For instance, many of the consonants and vowels of the Thai script are distinctly derived from counterparts within the Old Khmer script. The rise of the Sukhothai. The Khmer Empire had risen and peaked over a period of hundreds of years. Its fall was similarly protracted and occurred in stages between the 13th and 15th centuries. Ironically, a large factor in its decline was the rise of native kingdoms within Thailand, of a kind which would not have been possible had it not been for Khmer rule in the country. The most important of these was the emergence of the Sukhothai kingdom from the middle of the 13th century onwards. The capital of the new Thai kingdom was about 400 kilometres north of modern-day Bangkok. It adopted many of the systems of government and military administration which the Khmer had introduced into the country, and then used these same systems to oust the Khmer from the region. The first acknowledged independent Sukhothai ruler was Si Inthrathit, who became king in 1238 and ruled down to 1270. Under his rule, the Sukhothai not only pressed their independence from the Khmer, but also expanded into parts of what are now western Laos. Under one of his sons, Ramkham Khaeng, who ruled for 20 years between the late 1270s and the end of the 13th century, the Thai script was introduced. It was based on Old Khmer. The official position of Theravada Buddhism was also re-stressed during his reign after centuries of Khmer religious influences. This includes the survival of the enormous Ram Kamhang, inscriptions of a large rectangular obelisk or stele believed to date to around 1292 and containing lengthy inscriptions concerning the king's reign. The Sukhothai kingdom survived down to the middle of the 15th century, but long before then it had started to decline and was losing land to a much more powerful Thai state that emerged from the south down towards the Malay Peninsula. This was known as the Ayutthaya Kingdom, the Kingdom of Ayutthaya and the Sakdina system. The Sukhothai were under pressure from the late 14th century by a new Thai kingdom which emerged centred on the city of Ayutthaya, which lies just around 80 kilometres north of modern-day Bangkok. The Kingdom of Ayutthaya was founded by a ruler named Uthong in 1351. He is a quasi-legendary figure about whom little concrete is known. One later story even claimed that he was a Chinese explorer who arrived to Southeast Asia and gained a large following amongst the Thai. In all likelihood, he was a local ruler who simply built up his power base south of the Sukhothai and west of the Khmer Empire, as both of those states were weakening. Ayutthaya continued to expand. The preeminent ruler in their ascent was King Baroma Trilokanath, ruler of Ayutthaya for 4 decades between 1448 and 1488. He expanded the kingdom, acquiring new territory further south down the Malay Peninsula. As a result, his successors in centuries to come ruled over a region which was fairly approximate with modern-day Thailand. We know that Ayutthaya was a particularly powerful state here, as Dutch merchants and explorers, the foremost maritime power in the Far East and Southeast Asia in the 17th century, wrote about it as being the most powerful indigenous kingdom in Southeast Asia. Part of this ascent was based on the imposition of a kind of feudal system of social arrangement under King Baroma Trilokanath in the 15th century. This was known as the Sakdina system and contained elements of both the Hindu caste system and a more feudal arrangement. In this, individuals were graded in society according to a point system which allotted a certain number of points based on their social status. Aristocrats, monks and scholars, for instance, could have hundreds or even thousands of points, while commoners and slaves had very few points. This was codified as late as the early 19th century and elements of the Sakdina system are still adhered to in Thai society to this day. Early European contacts. The era of the Ayutthaya Kingdom was an era in which Thailand experienced its first extensive direct contacts with people from Europe. Thailand had been indirectly connected to Europe since ancient times via the maritime trade routes that ran from China through the South China Sea and the Malacca Straits to India, and then onwards to the Gulf of Persia and the Red Sea. The Romans, for instance, carried on a trade along this route, though with Indian and Sri Lankan intermediaries doing much of the work. What was new in the early modern period was the fact that contact between the people of Southeast Asia and from Europe was direct. The Portuguese were the first to arrive in what is now Thailand in 1511. Ayutthaya was important as it controlled an extensive part of the coast along the routes used by the Portuguese to get from India to the end of the Malay Peninsula and to the Spice Islands or Moluccas beyond, the holy grail of European overseas exploration at the time. For a long time, the Portuguese were the sole point of contact between Ayutthaya and Europe, bar one or two Spanish explorers. Then, in the early 17th century, the Dutch arrived, followed quickly thereafter by the English. Generally speaking, the Dutch became the predominant power in Southeast Asia, conquering most of what is now Indonesia in the 17th and 18th centuries. However, a little-known fact is that the French became active here in the second half of the 17th century and gained a lot of influence at the royal court in Bangkok. In 1688, this led to a popular revolt and the French were expelled from Ayutthaya. Thereafter, the Thai people traded exclusively with the Dutch. The Chakri dynasty and the Kingdom of Siam, almost a century after the expulsion of the French in 1688, a major shift in the politics of Thailand occurred. The Ayutthaya Kingdom had been powerful, yet it was always decentralised. In many ways, it was a federal union of northern and southern cities that came under the domination of Ayutthaya. The French interventions in the 17th century weakened the central authority of its rulers, and in the 18th century, Ayutthaya's power declined further as neighbours to the north invaded the northern cities. The Kingdom of Ayutthaya came to an end in 1762 and was soon replaced by a newly emergent power, the short-lived Thonburi Kingdom. This lasted for just over a decade and a half before the Kingdom of Siam emerged in 1782 under its king, Rama I. He was the first of the Chakri dynasty, the royal house that still rules Thailand as the traditional monarchical line to this day. There have been 10 monarchs of the Kingdom of Siam, which became the Kingdom of Thailand officially in 1949. Every one of these monarchs has taken the name Rama as ruler. Thus, Rama I ruled from 1782 to 1809. Rama II ruled from 1809 to 1824. Then Rama III from 1824 to 1827, 1851, and so forth. As we have seen, the Siamese kingdom was the only one in the region which managed to remain independent of European rule in the 19th century age of imperialism. It maintained a very traditional political system, with an absolute monarchy at least until 1932, when the Siamese Revolution resulted in the development of a constitutional monarchy in which the kings were sidelined by a parliament, though the royal family has continued to play a ceremonial role. Like many other nations of the Far East, Siam began to modernise rapidly in the middle of the 19th century, adopting elements of Western technology and society, and sending missions to Europe and the Americas to learn about things like Western education, industrialisation, and science. Siam was one of the very few nations which managed to use what it learned to continue to remain independent. Siam in an age of war, because it managed to maintain its independence during the age of imperialism that characterised the second half of the 19th century. Siam had the opportunity to steer its own independent course during the world wars of the 20th century. At first, Siam maintained its neutrality in the First World War. However, in July 1917, 3 months after the United States had entered the conflict, a decision which made the end result inevitable, Siam allied with France, Britain, and the US against Germany and its allies. A Siamese expeditionary force was even sent to Europe to fight on the Western Front in the final months of the war, but Thai involvement was limited on the whole. Conversely, Thailand was drawn deeply into the Second World War. The Japanese intended to try and secure the key British colony in the region, Singapore, after it went to war with the Western Allies. It intended to do so by approaching Singapore by land, as the port city was stoutly defended by huge cannons if anyone tried to approach by sea. As such, on the 8th of December 1941, as US ships were still sinking to the ocean floor at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii from the attacks just hours earlier on what was the 7th of December in Hawaii, the Japanese invade Thailand. The war between the two nations lasted 5 hours before the Siamese government surrendered and agreed to cooperate with the Japanese, allowing them passage through the country and into the Malay Peninsula. This contributed to the eventual Japanese capture of Singapore in February 1942. Theoretically, Thailand became an ally of Japan thereafter and declared war on the Allies as part of the Axis alliance. However, there was always a resistance movement within Thailand, and after the war ended, the Allies did not inflict much by way of punishment on the government of Siam, as the perception was that they had little choice but to ally with the Japanese in December 1941. Thailand. During the Indo-Chinese Crisis. The Second World War was not the end of Thailand's involvement in wider geopolitical conflicts in Southeast Asia. As the Japanese laid down their arms and accepted defeat in 1945, an issue arose. Independence movements and partisan groups of resistance fighters had emerged all over the Far East to oppose the Japanese during the war, most notably communist partisans in Indochina. They were unwilling to accept the reimposition of French colonial rule after the war ended, and wars of independence quickly broke out, as France tried to reassert itself. Often the partisans were aided in places like Vietnam by the Soviet Union, and so began to adopt communist rhetoric to ensure Moscow's support. The war between the Vietnamese and the French broadly ended in 1954, but thereafter, a new conflict emerged as the United States intervened to ensure that a Western, aligned military dictatorship in South Vietnam remained independent of the Soviet-aligned regime in North Vietnam. Over time, the Vietnam War resulted in wider contagion, and both Laos and Cambodia became mired in their own conflicts. The worst element of this was the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and the barbaric genocide they orchestrated in the second half of the 1970s. Thailand was inevitably drawn into these conflicts to some extent. It presented itself as a Western ally, and at the height of the Vietnam War, tens of thousands of US troops and army personnel were stationed in Thailand. Concurrently, there were issues with Cambodian and Laotian fighters spilling over the border into north and northeastern Thailand, while the attempted genocide in Laos of the Hmong people also led to a mass flight of Hmong refugees into Thailand. Therefore, while it tried to remain somewhat aloof from the conflicts to the east, Thailand was inevitably drawn into the wider Indo-Chinese crisis again and again between the 1940s and the 1970s, military juntas and student protests. In part because of these difficult geopolitical circumstances in Indochina in the post-war era, and also because most Asian and African nations simply went through tumultuous events like this after the Second World War, Thailand experienced a lot of internal political instability, conflict and violence from 1945 onwards. After the war, there was a brief period in which civilian rule was established. It did not last long, and in 1947, a military coup began the process, whereby military juntas ruled Thailand on and off. The monarchy did remain in place and provided considerable continuity, not least because King Rama IX of the Chakri dynasty ruled for 70 years between 1946 and 2016. Nevertheless, successive military generals were the real power in the country. In 1949, they changed the country's name officially from Siam to Thailand in honour of the fact the Thai people had settled here hundreds of years earlier. The juntas were not unchallenged. In 1973, mass protests led by university students forced the military dictator Thanom Kittikachorn to step down after many years of military rule. However, the shift towards more democratic rule was short-lived and was snuffed out by the Thammasat massacre of protesters in 1976. The 1990s saw a renewed attempt to establish a democratic regime and reaction against military rule that led to the co-called People's Constitution of 1997. This pattern of periods of democratic protest and attempted reform, followed by renewed military rule, continues to characterise Thailand's politics to this day. For instance, after 14 years as head of the Thai military, in 2014, Prayut Chan-o-cha led a coup which established the military junta, known as the National Council for Peace and Order, that ruled until 2019. Even the alleged transition back to democracy saw Prite remain in power until 2023. And today, despite the surface veneer of democracy, Thailand is broadly controlled by the military and shadowy forces behind the scenes. The Thai economic miracle. While Thailand experienced a range of political and social problems in the post-war era, it didn't stop the country from experiencing considerable economic growth. In fact, one of the reasons why the military juntas have held power for so long is that they have presided over periods of pronounced economic prosperity. This was not quite on the same scale as the Asian Tigers, a term usually applied to Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, 4 nations that experienced unprecedented growth between the 1960s and 1990s that made them extremely wealthy Asian nations for their comparatively small size. Thailand was slightly below them, but far ahead of other Southeast Asian nations like the Philippines, Cambodia, Laos, or Indonesia that did not have anything near the same growth during this era. Beginning in the 1960s, Thailand started to experience an average of about 7% or 8% GDP growth annually. Admittedly, it was starting from a low base of economic development, but the sustained manner of this growth between the 1960s and the early 1990s was quite significant. Some years were really exceptional. The Thai economy, for instance, grew by over 13% in 1988, followed by 12% growth in 1989 and 11% in 1990. This means that in early 1991, the Thai economy was around 40% larger than it had been in late 1987. Thailand had the world's fastest growing economy overall between 1985 and 1994. This growth was achieved on the back of the development of small industry and more intensive agriculture at first, and then a diversification into small electronics and other manufacturing in the late 1970s and 1980s. Effectively, Thailand followed the model set by the Asian Tigers. It also benefited from exploitation of natural resources such as tin mining and the discovery of extensive amounts of natural gas in the Gulf of Thailand. Finally, Thailand began to emerge as a major centre of tourism, with Bangkok, Chiang Mai, and the islands becoming a special magnets for Western tourists. This especially became the case in the 1990s and has continued down to the present day as Thailand has presented itself as a haven for digital nomads. There have been setbacks. Thailand was caught up in the economic crisis that gripped the Asian Tigers in the second half of the 1990s as their economies overheated after decades of exponential growth, while there have been complaints of over-tourism in modern times. But owing to its economic miracle, Thailand has emerged as one of the wealthiest nations for its size in Asia, especially for one that has not benefited from large petroleum reserves like the nations of the Middle East. Clashes with Cambodia news headlines in 2025 have focused on a particular modern problem for Thailand: clashes with neighbouring Cambodia. As we have seen, the relationship between Cambodia and Thailand is a long and complex one that saw the Khmer Empire rule over Thailand in centuries gone by, and Siam ruling over parts of Laos and Cambodia in the period after that. Given this complex history, there have inevitably been border disputes between these nations in modern times, a byproduct of the borders here effectively being created by French imperialists in the 19th century, more so than any local mediators. In the 1950s, as French colonial rule in Indochina came to an end, disputes arose between the Thai and Cambodian governments about parts of the border, which extends for more than 800 kilometres between the two countries. In particular, there have been disagreements over the ownership of an 11th century temple along the border, which Cambodia moved to register as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for Cambodia back in 2008. These tensions have led to many border clashes over the years, often related to wider political crises within the two countries. They have boiled over again in 2025 after a border clash on the 24th of July led to the deaths of a dozen Thai nationals. This sparked the flight of hundreds of thousands of people from the disputed border region within days, as dozens more people were killed and large numbers of troops were moved into the region by both sides. The conflict may remain contained but points towards the manner in which the border region could become the potential flashpoint for a more serious war later this century. So where or what is next for Thailand? The clashes along the border with Cambodia in the summer of 2025 will probably prove to be a temporary flare of violence that will not result in anything dramatic in the long term. Yet Thailand faces many challenges as well as opportunities. Probably the greater danger in terms of its neighbours comes from Myanmar. Although it has fallen out of the news cycle since the worst of the attempted genocide of the Rohingya people there back in 2017, in reality the country is racked by civil war, and the military junta's position has become extremely weak. The years ahead could see the crisis turn even bloodier and more refugees spilling over the border into northern Thailand, destabilising Thailand in the process. On top of this, Thailand faces issues with being pulled too closely into the orbit of China. For instance, in recent years, the Thai government has had to pass legislation to try to limit the buying up of vast amounts of real estate in cities like Chiang Mai by Chinese business people and companies, as the country was starting to become a de facto colony of Chinese capital. Perhaps most worryingly, Thailand is at the forefront of escalating extreme weather patterns in Southeast Asia. The 2011 floods that struck the country, killing hundreds and causing approximately $50 billion worth of damage in Bangkok and elsewhere, were a clear sign of how exposed Thailand is to climate change in the decades ahead. These impediments and dangers aside, Thailand's economic miracle in modern times is such that it has emerged as one of the richer nations in Asia, and it might very well continue on that path if it can deal with the many potential pitfalls before it. One thing is for sure, it has been a complex history from Lampang Man to the modern day.